Welcome back. This is the first lecture for Chapter 6 on nonverbal communication. In this lecture, we are going to overview what nonverbal communication is and some of the important ways that it influences our interpersonal relationships. And then we will also talk about and introduce the communication systems and the channels within those communication systems for nonverbal communication. Nonverbal communication, as defined in your textbook, encompasses any behaviors and characteristics that convey meaning in our interactions without actually using words. So some common examples would be like waving hi to somebody, blowing them a kiss, things of those nature. But it also is a lot more complex than that. So touching somebody gently on the shoulder, hugging them to comfort them, all of those things are also covered in this chapter under nonverbal communication. Nonverbal communication has some very important characteristics and kind of implications in our relationships with others and our communication in those relationships. The first, kind of characteristic is that nonverbal communication is present in most interpersonal conversations. So when we go back to the first lecture where I covered the 3 models of communication, the feedback loop. So in that second model, when we really incorporated that feedback loop and then we carried that through to the third model, nonverbal communication is a really important feature of that feedback loop. So things like eye contact, nodding your head to show understanding, your facial expressions that show empathy or confusion, all of those things really feed into and play an important role in that feedback loop. In more mediated forms of communication, we have worked to include the certain elements of nonverbal communication that can get lost in some of the mediated communication that we have. So thinking about things like text messaging, we insert emojis, smiley faces. Now we have like bitmojis that are a little bit more involved. But all of those things, the purpose of them is to really give some context to the written words. So prior to the common use of emojis, the text messaging could get it's kind of flat, right? It can get misconstrued, misunderstood. You're unsure if that person is joking or not, and so the emojis kind of really help cut some tension that can exist when we're communicating via text message. Nonverbal communication often conveys more information than verbal communication. The textbook says that about 60 to 70% of communication is nonverbal. Nonverbal channels add a lot of richness to our interactions. So when we think back to these channel-rich contexts and interactions that we have, oftentimes they're channel rich because we are using and relying on these nonverbal channels. It's one of the reasons why face-to-face communication is one of the most channel rich contexts in which we can communicate in. You'll see in this lecture that we have many different channels of nonverbal communication. And so, because there is such breadth in terms of the ways in which we communicate nonverbally, it really begins to make sense as to why 60 to 70% of our communication is actually through the non-spoken word, through the gestures and facial expressions and the other ways that we communicate meaning without using language. Because of this, nonverbal communication is often believed over verbal communication. So we'll talk a little bit in this chapter about how emotion is conveyed through things like facial expressions and vocalics. So those are the 2 primary ways in which we communicate emotion. And when we are communicating emotion in those ways, when our verbal communication contradicts our nonverbal communication, we begin to believe the verbal communication. We'll talk a lot more about this when we talk about the functions of nonverbal communication in your next lecture for this chapter. But just let me give you an example. So, let's say that you go to your significant other and maybe you're kind of in the precipice of a conflict, of an argument, and your significant, you ask your significant other like, are we okay? Are you okay? And, their posture is really kind of leaned inward. word. Their facial expressions is kind of scowling, and they say this, that they're okay in a certain tone. They go, yeah, I'm fine. Really thinking about the vocalics associated with those messaging. You're likely to conclude, even though the verbal message, the language that is being conveyed, says, yeah, that the person's fine, that they're not mad at you, that everything's good. The nonverbal channels, right? The facial expressions, the posture, the tone of that message, all convey that they're not fine, that there's something still wrong, that you need to talk about something, or that they're angry with you. And in that case, you are likely to believe the nonverbals over the verbals. And so that's really where we're getting at with this characteristic. And we're going to talk a lot more about that when we talk about the influence and kind of the interaction of nonverbals and verbal in written communication. So, I already said this, that nonverbal communication is the primary means at which we convey emotion, again, through facial expressions and vocalics. And the last characteristic here is that nonverbals help to convey meaning and enrich meta-communication. So meta-communication, as defined in your textbook, is communication about communication. So sometimes when we are involved in relationships, we have an interaction. That interaction goes really well or it goes really poorly. And we find ourselves communicating about how we communicated in a previous interaction. And that's really what meta-communication is. So say you had an argument with your best friend, things got really heated, you stepped away from that argument for a little while, and then you come back and you kind of have that reconciliation, but then you begin to talk about, I got really upset when you criticized the way that, I do X, Y, and Z, and it's not necessarily what you were saying, but it's the tone in which you were saying it. Without saying it, you were saying that I'm lazy or that I'm not a caring friend, and I don't really think that's true, right? So those kinds of messaging really are meta communication. You're communicating about how you communicated about the problem that you were communicating earlier. Meta communication helps us understand how messages should be interpreted, and nonverbal communication plays a large role in that. And so thinking about, oftentimes in meta communication, we're using a lot of nonverbals to help ease kind of the tension when we're talking about how we communicated in an earlier interaction. In interactions, it really adds context cues. So help, going back to pragmatics, helping understand how verbal messages should be interpreted and decoded in our interactions. So what I want you to do now in the discussion box on Play Closet is I want you to reflect on your own communication with others. So you can pick an interpersonal relationship. I want you to consider what kinds of information you receive through nonverbal channels and how does that information help or interfere during the interaction. So kind of getting at the two main things that we're going to be talking about from this chapter, the channels and the ways in which we receive and send nonverbal communication or nonverbal messages, and the functions of those messages. And I really want you to begin to reflect and discuss on that now. So think about your own experiences and then comment and interact with your peers by commenting on one of their posts. So we're going to start looking at the specifics of nonverbal communication by looking at the three channels of nonverbal communication. So, I've taken the three categories, and scholars, communication scholars, have taken the three or the 10 communication channels that are listed in your textbook and really divided them or categorized them into three communication systems. Three systems that are really important for conveying meaning beyond words. And the first is the visual system, the second is the auditory system, and the third is the invisible communication system. So that's how we're going to discuss these, the many different channels that were outlined and laid out in your textbook, dealing with and understanding the nonverbal communication. So let's start with the visual communication system. The visual communication system includes proxemics. So this is the first channel of nonverbal communication that we are going to discuss. And proxemics involve the use of space. So thinking about understanding the distancing between you and your communication partner. And there are what we call zones, so spatial zones that help us understand, provide some sort of context to the communication that's going on in our relationships. So when we are about 12 or more feet away from the person who's communicating or communicating with, we call that the public distance. And this would be representative of like large lectures, public appearances. So thinking about maybe more of that linear or action model happening here when we are engaging in the public distance, so 12 feet or more away from the person. Getting a little bit closer, so between 4 feet and 12 feet, we have what we call the social distance. And this is really when we're thinking about kind of casual conversations, thinking about when you're meeting people for the first time, you're not really talking to them very closely, unless maybe you're in like a cramped space. If we think about kind of just having casual conversations, maybe, at a restaurant, you're separated by like the table. So really thinking about that for being reserved for more like acquaintances or the beginning of our relationships with people before we've really made it a more intimate connection. Then we have personal distance. Personal distance involves communication interactions that exist for between 4 feet and 18 inches. And this distance is really reserved for interactions between friends and family. So thinking about, maybe if you're having some like holiday gatherings, you're probably sitting close, next to people on the couch, sitting close to them at the table. And because they're friends and family, you're able to kind of let them into your bubble. In this space, I kind of determine this as like my personal space, my bubble, and my friends and family are allowed into that personal space. But kind of acquaintances, it's really strange if they would come into that bubble. The last spatial zone is intimate distance, and so this is 0 to 18 inches, and this is reserved for our most personal, intimate others. So thinking about maybe your romantic partner, thinking about maybe your best friends, probably your parents and siblings. You think about sitting like snuggling on the couch. I know my husband and I, we really like to cuddle and snuggle with our son and with each other, and so those are probably the most important people in my life, and they're allowed into that intimate space. I allow my son to kind of sit on my lap, and we, rock in the rocking chair, and I use that, intimate distance to really show. So when we think about the functions, to show that I'm there. I love him, and he's supported. And nonverbal communication is really important when we think about, especially thinking about children. So kinesics is the next channel in the visual communication system. Kinesics involves body movements and gestures. Your chapter talked about 6 different kinds of gestures in the readings for today, for chapter 6. So thinking about emblems is the first gesture that's used. So this would be a gesture that has a direct verbal translation. So oftentimes we'll wave hello to somebody. Maybe a more negatively valenced gesture would be like giving somebody the middle finger, and we all know what that means, right? So these are emblems that have a direct verbal translation. Using that gesture with your hand gives a very clear message that would have a clear verbal translation. Illustrators are gestures, and again, gestures are things that we use with our hands and arms. Illustrators go along with the verbal message, so if we were trying to illustrate size or shape of something, the example I give in class, and if you'd be able to see me right now, I'm doing it with my hands as well. So thinking about like showing how big a fish is. So I caught it big and it was this big, and we hold our hands up and we show them. That is an illustrator. An affect display involves communicating emotions through our hands and gestures. So thinking about sometimes when we're nervous, we might tap our finger on the table, we might pick at our fingers, and so thinking about different ways in which we would communicate emotion, things like nervousness or anxiety. Regulators are gestures that regulate the flow of interaction. So sometimes if you're talking and somebody's trying to interject, you might hold your hand up, you might put your finger up and tell them to just kind of wait a second. And that was an example of how we might regulate the flow of interaction. Thinking about in a classroom, students raise their hand when they want to ask a question. And that is an example of a regulator signaling to the person that you have a question you want to speak in that context. The last gesture is adapters, and adapters are used to satisfy some sort of personal need. And so, if we think about like flipping your hair or tucking your hair behind your ear, all of those things would be involved with adapting. And adapters are also connected to our displays of emotion. So thinking about when we engage in those adapters, oftentimes it's because we're maybe nervous or we're excited in an interaction. So kinesics also include, so in addition to gestures, that also include body movements. So kind of like how we are, what our posture is, if we are kind of moving about the room, all of those things would fall into kinesics. The third channel in the visual communication system is facial displays. And so facial displays have three important functions when we are thinking about nonverbal communication and the visual communication system. Facial displays help us identify and tell people apart. They give us some level of attraction. So your chapter really talked about the symmetry of faces. So if a face is more symmetrical and more proportionate, then we tend to consider those facial displays as being more attractive. But one thing that what I would consider the primary function of facial displays is to convey emotion. And we're really going to talk a lot about this when we talk about some of the functions of our nonverbal communication in the next lecture. So we use our facial displays to really communicate our emotions. We're smiling, we're frowning, we have that kind of confused look on our face, and that sends a lot of information about how we are feeling to others. The fourth channel in the visual communication system is eye behaviors. Eye behaviors, eye contact we can also call it, is important to signal attraction. We might wink at somebody, we gain credibility. So when we are thinking about maybe in an interview or in a first kind of small talk interaction, really maintaining eye contact is showing some level of like investment and credibility, kind of showing your confidence in that interaction. Because of that, it's oftentimes used to persuade others, to show responsiveness in that interaction. Really important in that feedback loop that we talked about earlier. So eye contact is really important and really one of the channels that students connect with and understand the most when we think about nonverbal communication. Artifacts are objects and visual features in the environment that reflect some aspect of our identity. So the way that we dress can communicate information about ourselves, kind of the way that our furniture is arranged in our living room and our office, thinking about artifacts like a wedding ring or a promise ring. All of those things really communicate information about kind of who we are and what social groups we're a part of. Many of you may wear your Bloomsburg University, I have one on right now actually, Bloomsburg University t-shirt or sweatshirt to class, and maybe you're wearing them out in your hometowns really to show that you are part of that community. And that sweatshirt, that labeling is considered an artifact, and it's communicating information about yourself. It's communicating that you were affiliated with Bloomsburg University, and that's a part, at least somewhat important part of who you are. And finally, when we think about physical appearance as a function of the visual communication system and a channel of nonverbal communication, we're really thinking about, kind of how our physical appearance influences how people judge us, and whether we want to, whether we think that's a good thing or a bad thing, it's a real thing, right? How we're dressed, how we groom ourselves, is going to send a message about kind of maybe how friendly people perceive that we are, how competent we are at accomplishing a task, how social of a person we are. And so when we think about the kind of impression management and we talk about competence, here we really see those things coming into play. Physical appearance matters, whether we like it or not. People make judgments, snap judgments based on our physical appearance, and we need to consider that when we are engaging in impression management and in thinking about how we communicate information about ourselves. The next system of nonverbal communication is the auditory system. And the auditory system is primarily made up of vocalics. The vocal behaviors or paralanguage that go along with our verbal communication. So these really involve our voice. They are paired with our verbal language, but they are not the words themselves. Vocalics are things like pitch and inflection, rate and volume, filler words. I've been listening to my lectures and I've noticed I use a lot, and I apologize for that. I'm trying to work on including more silence as opposed to that filler word, but it is important. We use fillers when we are collecting our thoughts and thinking about what we're going to say next. And we, silence again right there. And we have pronunciation, articulation, and accent. All of these things really involve our language, our verbal communication, but they are nonverbal because they are separate from those symbols that we talked about in the language chapter. So pitch is really how high or how deep our voice is. Inflection involves the expressive, kind of the tone. We can also call this tone. So are we speaking in a really expressive way? Do we have a more monotone voice? What is the variation in our pitch here? Tone has a really important part in determining kind of the context and the purpose of the message. Rate, how fast or slow we talk. Volume, how loud or soft we talk. Volume really is important when we think about things like privacy in an interaction. We talked a little bit about filler words already. Thinking about how we pronounce words, we think about language in terms of kind of the syntactics and semantics. So thinking about pronunciations can change from geographic location. How we articulate words can change too. How clearly or articulate we are engaging in interacting. Using language can influence things like our credibility, and then accents. So how the kind of pronounce a certain word according to a certain geographic location. The last system is the invisible communication system. The invisible communication system is made up of olfactics, the use of smell. So thinking about the smell is really important. I think about it a lot during the holidays. I have candles like Christmas sleigh candle. I'm burning right now my pine tree candle. And those really signal kind of the holidays and Christmas for me. They get me into the Christmas spirit. And this is because olfactics, smell, has been linked to memories. So we have this olfactic associations. Memories are linked to specific smells. They can trigger certain moods and emotions. Your chapter talked about pheromones, the importance of pheromones in sexual attraction. All of these things are fairly subconscious, but they're really important in terms of kind of how we feel and the emotion that we feel, and that can influence our communication with others. So I was just telling my husband, the other day, I was like, wow, I've finished grading and I'm teaching this winter class, and I really haven't had time to get into the Christmas spirit. And so one of the things that I do, I play music, which is important, and we light our tree, and I light the Christmas candles because those smells remind me and put me into the Christmas spirit. They have an important role in kind of my emotion and my mood, which influences kind of my spirit and how I communicate with my family during this time. Chronemics is the use of time. We use chronemics when we spend time with others. We show them that we care by spending more time with them. We can show power and dominance through chronemics. So when you think about, have a meeting with your advisor and they're a little bit late, it's kind of, it's okay. You hear rumors, when in an in-person class, I try not to be late, but I hear students mumbling about kind of the 5 or 10 minute or 15-minute rule that we wait for our professors. And that's really signaling kind of that use of time, in the use of power and seniority in those interactions. Haptics involve the use of touch. So we have some different types of touch in our in this category. We have affectionate touch, so things like hand holding, hugging. All of these types of touch, affectionate touch, are important for increasing our mental and physical well-being and reducing stress. We also have interactions, and so affectionate touch is really important in our romantic and interpersonal relationships. Well, there's also other times that we touch people. So thinking about caregiving touch, your hairdresser, your doctor may touch you. We know, hopefully, that this isn't to show affection or communicate love or intimacy, but it's more of a task-oriented touch, right? So they have to, touch your hair or your neck in order to cut your hair. Your doctor has to, check your pulse and feel around in maybe certain areas of your body to diagnose you if you're having a problem. And so thinking about touch in that caregiving sense. We also know that sometimes touch can be used maybe for ill will. So thinking about showing power and control. We can think about kind of abuse in relationships, but we can also think about power control in a more positive way. So, when I think about when I'm out with my son and, we're getting out of the car and he likes to run, right? So I can tell he's about to run out into the parking lot, and I grab his arm and I pull him back, right? And so that's a form of touch. It's showing power and having control over him, not for ill will, but for safety, right? So for protecting, kind of his overall health and safety, making sure he's not getting hit by a car, which is really important to me and to society and things of that nature. We also have aggressive touch. So thinking about, kind of in relation to some of those ill will forms in which we show power, sometimes we touch people, we can show physical harm. And so thinking about that. We also have the last form of touch is ritualistic touch. So things when we think about kind of like when we meet people for the first time, we shake their hand often. Maybe when, we meet our friends and family for the first time, we hug them. So thinking about some of those forms of touch that are wrapped into our greeting rituals and other rituals that we have in our society that make touching appropriate and send some sort of message about that interaction. So that concludes the first part of Chapter 6 on nonverbal communication. The next lecture is going to discuss the different functions of nonverbal communication, which are important in the interactions that we have.